Welcome to the Embodied Sounds podcast, where we explore how music and sound add to our collective well-being in mind, body, and spirit. In order to keep this podcast free of advertising, please consider joining our Patreon community. Your support will go towards the creation of this show, as well as original music compositions and recording projects to help us all reduce stress and live a healthier and happier life. Learn more at www.embodiedsounds.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Embodied Sounds podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Sam Miller. We're here talking about all the benefits of music and sound and how it can add to your life. Today I'm going to be chatting with a very old friend of mine, known each other since high school, my friend Jeremy Young. He lives in Montreal, Canada, and we're so excited to have him on the podcast today. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
Can you tell us a bit about kind of where you are? What is this room we're catching you in today?
Yes. This is the room of oscillators. I will try to move my laptop just ever so slightly so that you could get a view of that. Right, so this is my home studio in Montreal, as you said. This is where I, for the most part, created almost everything on the record that I just put out called Amara. I guess it's where I create most of my music. But as you can see in the background, there's sort of tape machines, analog sine and square wave oscillators, and a few, I guess, just sort of outboard processing units and stuff like that. So the idea is that this space is sort of conducive to entering and then creating spontaneously and improvising sort of immediately. What you can't see, which is in front of me, is that there's like some sound treatment in front of me. I have some monitor speakers. I have a laptop and a mixing board. But I like this studio set up as such because everything's already plugged in. So if I feel like a moment of inspiration or something, I can just kind of come in, turn everything on. It takes a little while for some of this stuff to turn on because it's tube based, so the tubes have to heat up. But then, just sort of start kind of creating. And I won't anticipate some of the questions that you'll ask me in this interview, but that's a big part of my process, is just sort of creating in a state of flow and then going back later to sort of identify little motifs or little ideas that I can then sort of enhance and execute. Yeah.
Amazing. Looks like a beautiful studio.
Thanks.
Let's see. I'm curious kind of what inspiration, looks like to you. Can you tell us about a moment recently where you have had that kind of hit of, oh, I got an idea and I'm going to sit down and do something now?
Yeah. Well, it definitely takes a lot of different shapes. And it's funny that you asked that in that way, because there's sort of a general answer that I can give, which is my, I guess, theories about inspiration and creativity in general and at large. But then as an answer to your question, on the record that I just put out, there's this great sort of little micro story that I can tell about a moment of inspiration. I'll start with the general thing. So basically, my sort of theory about creativity in general is based on Aristotle's concept of praxis and poiesis. Praxis is the notion, it's I guess today you'd kind of consider it just sort of like rehearsing and improvising and just sort of setting up and playing, which I do a lot of. But it's the idea of action for the sake of itself. So just creating acts, whether it's artistic acts or just going out into the world and doing mitzvahs and sort of good sort of society-minded acts or whatever, for no other sort of greater meaning than the act itself. There's this concept, and then that's sort of weighed against this concept of poiesis, which is acting with a final result in mind. So the idea of, I set out to make a record. So everything that I do in this linear state of affairs is building towards that sort of final culmination of these ideas. And my sort of theory of creativity is that at any given moment, we need to be balancing both of these. I can start improvising. I can just kind of mess around a little bit and play around in these sort of ideas, these audio ideas and musical concepts or whatever. And it's fine. It's okay. I don't want to feel any pressure to sort of, oh, is this going to be on the album? Should I redo that? Does that sound too weird or whatever? I don't necessarily have to get lost in my own brain, but there is a time and a place for that. In this like other state of poiesis, according to Aristotle, where it actually benefits me as a creative person to sort of have this like pin in the future. That's my sort of end goal, and that's the end result that I think my work is culminating towards, and I can start sort of like editing in real time towards that end goal. I like to just sort of balance both, and I like to keep my mind on the fact that to minimize my own like stress and anxiety about creative work, just remind myself that like at any given moment, I can be one or the other or a combination of both, and it's totally fine. Like there's a place for that in my creativity. So that's sort of like one thing. I guess that's like my general perspective on creativity. But you asked about a moment of inspiration, and there is a good story to tell about that, where people often what's the turn of phrase that I'm looking for? I guess people often describe like inspiration as like catching lightning in a bottle or something, right? Where it's like, okay, there's a moment and it strikes like lightning, and you have to sort of be ready for that with your little bottle to sort of capture it and capture all that energy. And like, I don't necessarily subscribe to that, but there was a really great night where I had the night off, and so I wanted to sort of work on my album. I wanted to like work on a piece or something. I really had no inspiration at all. And there's a window in front of me that I can kind of pull down like a sound buffering shade to, but the window was open, and I could see that to the east of me, there was like a lightning storm in the sky, like an actual lightning storm, like not a metaphorical, like hypothetical lightning storm, but there was an actual lightning storm. And you could hear these crashes of thunder and stuff, and you could hear these flashes of light. And yeah, like in my own little home studio here, it kind of felt like a club. It kind of felt like there was like a rhythm to it. There's like lights flashing and there's like crashes and stuff. So I was sort of like playing with that idea, and I was like, it's beautiful. I'm like looking at this sort of beauty, this like terrifying power happening in the sky that's also really beautiful. And I just let it rip, I was like letting the oscillators go. I decided to sort of try to find this like flow. So I built an ostinato. Just a repeating sort of bass form is just like the 1 and the 5 of whatever key signature I was in, using some of these oscillators, and I looped it. So there's this ostinato going. It's just like a 1 and a 5, very minimal sort of grid structure for laying down an improvisation. I recorded that. I looped it. I went back to the oscillators and I started improvising. And that track, I eventually titled, it's on the album, I eventually titled it Electricity Over Mirabelle, which, electricity in the skies. It's sort of an homage to the lightning moment that happened both inspirationally and literally in the sort of manifesting of this piece. And I really like that.
Amazing. Oh, that's a good story. And it's a beautiful album. I did get to listen to it this week. Want to hear more about that a little bit later for sure. But congratulations on the release and getting that out there. I know how much work goes into that. So like huge accomplishment, bro. Really, really impressive stuff. And it's not your first release. You've been doing this for a long time. And I like what you said about getting into a rhythm. I want to kind of talk about that and how has maybe percussion and rhythm been a part of your journey. I remember jamming with you quite a bit when we were in our teenage years, and I'm curious if that like early introduction to just rhythm as a practice has been how has that shown up in your life? And yeah, just tell us a bit about how you engage with rhythm.
That's so great that you asked about that. So for those listening, Josh and I did grow up together, and we not only performed in the high school band together, both as clarinetists, but we would sort of stay after school, do some slightly illicit activities, and engage in drum circles with djembes and stuff. And this was such an important part of my upbringing. I did sort of like leave percussion behind in college in favor of more melodic, relationship with music. So I took up the guitar, joined a rock band, which rock music is very rhythmic, but I wasn't really responsible for the rhythm. And so for many years, actually, in my 20s, I was mostly thinking melodically. I was playing guitar. I was involved with some more experimental stuff, but it was ambient, and it was really like harmonically rich. And for many years, I pretty much sort of only engaged with the melodic aspect of making music. And that definitely changed, but it changed in this really organic and gradual way. Eventually, I started to sort of build more like textural accompaniment to my music. I have a band called Sontag Shogun right now, which is piano, voice, and analog and digital sort of soundscapes and textures. And I sort of became responsible for the analog stuff, making use of tones from the oscillators, but also sort of textures with contact mics and amplified objects and surfaces, with this really sort of like Foley state of mind, like something like that, or like I don't know. Here's like a pine brush, like you could sort of hear that. So that's sort of what I tend to contribute to this project, and it's like a textural thing. Eventually, when I started making music on my own without the help of other bandmates, I had to I realized I had to think, okay, I've got melody, I've got sort of texture and arrangement and accompaniment down pat, and harmony. I need a rhythmic element. There is no rhythmic element to my music, and I sort of had to like hack my relationship with rhythm back together based on these like tools that I'm using, like tape and contact mics and oscillators and stuff. And this is it's not easy to be like a one-man band when you're sort of utilizing these like weird old vintage machines. So my engagement with rhythm came from the process of looping, just repetition, like tape loops, just making use of like these motifs that are sort of repeated, and you build on that, which is a lot of how I engage with music from a core place now, but also from the textures that I was creating in like a very ambient way, like these sort of soundscapes, like field recordings and brushes. And, from that, I've been able to sort of figure out a way to use like live looping techniques to create percussive rhythms, making use of those tools and techniques. So now my music sort of ticks all those boxes. It's like there's melody, there's harmony, there's song form and structure, which is very new to me. We can talk about that if you want. I don't really necessarily have to, but I also now have this engagement with rhythm that is coming from a place that is so core and organic. And I honestly think it's attributed to, all of those like afternoons and moments that we spent just sort of jamming and like just creating rhythms and building on it and working with polyrhythms and getting that ingrained in our systems. I went away for a little while, but now I'm sort of back to that. And it just feels so innate to explore that.
Wonderful. I'm really happy to hear that. And I can totally relate. You did mention we also played clarinet together in our high school band. I just happened to get back into the clarinet and bought a tenor saxophone, which is new for me. And I'm kind of making that transition to a melodic instrument from percussive instruments as we speak. So I can totally understand. And Yeah, I like the point that you make that no matter how long you go, maybe in between certain practices, it's all still with you and can come back. I'm definitely learning that right now with these wind instruments.
Yeah, and the wind instruments, I think now you're also sort of able to kind of re-explore microtonality as well. Like,
Yes.
you know, the hand drums and the tongue drums and stuff. Those are sort of like these fixed tones, and it's what's great that that you play is like it's rhythmic and it's melodic, but they're fixed tones. And then the thing with wind instruments is that you can bend tones and you can really explore microtonality and the in-between spaces and stuff, which is just this whole other world, which is awesome.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And a big goal with this podcast is to really help people who maybe haven't discovered a creative outlet yet, find something that is helpful for them to express themselves. And obviously sound and music is kind of our focus and the core, and that's what has worked for me. For somebody else, that could look many different ways: painting, dancing, drawing, hiking, whatever. And I'm curious, like, if you could tell us a bit about maybe your process of finding a creative outlet to help you in life, just channel emotions and kind of feel, good in your own experience. Like, would you have any tips for someone who's kind of like, maybe they haven't found that yet? If you could think back to who you were at the time before you found this wonderful interest in tape looping and musical expression.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that the world today is very different from the world that we grew up in. Everybody always says that. It's like it's a generational, whatever. Yeah. Like it's commonplace when you're talking about intergenerational things. But the world today is kind of an incredible like asset for creative thinking and creative acts, in that technology has become so democratized and so cheap and accessible. Anybody with like an iPhone or a phone can actually create a Billboard charting album. Like, it's like, okay, so that's amazing. But that's also sort of a little bit of a crutch for young people, because when I grew up, I had no dreams of becoming like a professional anything. It was really just, do I like music? Can I just play music for the sake of playing it? And just have a great time and meet people who like the same kind of music as me and talk about it or whatever. I never thought, oh, I'm going to be a professional musician or I'm going to work in music. That dream was a little bit too far out for me. And I think that was actually kind of healthy, because, you end up spending time just playing, just living a little bit of a creative life, not really feeling guilty for if, I never define myself as a musician. So that means that I can go and make this painting or write a poem, and not feel guilty that I'm spending time away from my passion. Unfortunately for young people today, there's such a clear path, with like people sort of making a living off of Instagram and TikTok, as like professional dancers, or making music that just gets picked up really quickly on social media. There's such a clear path to a career in creativity that I think young people are actually scared to even start. And I could be wrong about this because I don't have kids and I'm not a young person, but this is coming from sort of actually having a daily engagement with a lot of young people who are looking to learn music through my job, which is I do online music education for a startup. So I am kind of around this, and I'm around this sort of imposter syndrome, a sort of fear of failure that is prevalent around young people, where it's like, like, okay, I can make a song, but my song sucks and I suck and I'm not really that good at it. So, screw it. I'm not even going to try or whatever. And that's a little bit of a plague today. So your question kind of cuts at the heart of this really interesting place where we are right now with like technology and accessibility to the creative arts, where it's probably more open than it's ever been. Anyone can just like pick up an instrument and start playing. And especially with social media, you have access to a global network of people who can become your friends and become your mentor or your coach or your tutor, become your role model and your inspiration. Like, this is all at our fingertips, and yet there's still a little bit of a sense of like trepidation, I think. So do I have any advice? Not really, but I think my only advice would just be that like young people, or really anyone in life at any stage in life, like it's okay to just like do something and to like let the pressure just sort of like just like fall off of your shoulders. You know, it's okay to sort of not put everything into the timeline of your life and put a lot of importance on any one given thing. If you feel like picking up a drum and banging away at it or whatever, or you feel like just sort of walking over to that drum circle that's happening in the park, or if you feel like just dancing to a song that comes on, even though nobody else is dancing, like, you don't have to be a professional dancer. Just like live in the moment, you know? And over time, you'll sort of deepen your relationship with these other forms of creativity. If it speaks to you, it's going to stick with you. If it doesn't speak with you, it's fine.
Well said, man. I think that's some great advice and just sharing of your own experience there. So thank you for that. And it's definitely helpful to think about young people who are just starting out, and also, you know, folks our age and potentially even older.
Late bloomers.
Totally. and career changers and just hobby changers. And I think in the last year alone, many of us have discovered something that maybe we didn't even know we like doing, and you know, have really developed a new relationship with our life and our practices. So I think it's totally relevant no matter how old you are.
That's actually kind of that's something I don't often think about, but it is something that I've sort of picked up on. You know, like I started like, you know, back when we were young together, you know, we started in classical music. We were in the school band. We were performing, you know, marches for the football team, and we were doing classical music from and like John Williams kind of scores to Star Wars and Disney films and stuff like that. And so eventually I kind of got into improvisation and jazz, and eventually that kind of transitioned to like being in a rock band, which was like really sort of contemporary and a lot about like energy and, you know, like a live feel to it. Eventually, you know, down the road, I sort of transitioned to a little bit more of an intellectual engagement with sound, where, I mean, whatever. It's experimental stuff that I do now, but it comes from a lot of sort of concepts and philosophies that I'm teasing out. But all along that way, you know, when I was in a rock band, you're sort of touring and you're on the circuit. There's opening bands. There's people that you open for. There's other bands that are playing or whatever. You engage with other rock musicians. If you're in a jazz band, you're playing jazz clubs. You're engaging with other jazz musicians. Now I'm on this touring circuit where it's experimental, it's improvised. There's people doing a lot of different things. But the multi-generational aspect of it is so interesting, because I feel like I'm a late bloomer whenever I perform with somebody who's like 22 and they're using a lot of the same, you know, sonic techniques that I'm using. I feel like, oh man, I'm so late to this game. At the same time, I'll sometimes like open for somebody who's like 70 years old and they're like this incredible, profound, prolific artist. And I feel just honored to even be sharing a room with them. And, you know, backstage and in the green room before and after the shows, I'll like pick their brain about their experience, and I kind of get to play around in that like older statesman sort of mentality or whatever. And I know that eventually, like down the line, I'm passing that off to some of the young people as well. And I just love that. I love that you can sort of exist in all these different worlds, and just like kind of grab things from them and glean from them, and just sort of think, you know, kind of in the moment, think in the process of you sort of building your artistic career, like what actually speaks to me? Like, oh yeah, there was this young kid doing this crazy thing that like opened for me like 2 nights ago or whatever. Is that interesting to me? Yeah, I guess like some of that stuff is interesting. I'll think about that for a little bit. And just kind of incorporate that into your practice and into your like mental space and stuff when you're creating music. I absolutely love that. And I think it's like the more you make music, the more you naturally evolve. We're never going to stay the same over the course of an entire lifetime or an entire sort of creative career. We're always just picking up these little things and bringing it into our process and then streamlining and stripping it away and cutting down to the core. You know, I love that.
I love that, man. Well said, well said. And yeah, in talking about your transition from kind of how we started in a symphonic band, you know, playing John Williams scores and a little bit of classical compositions from a long time ago to playing in jazz improvisation groups and then eventually rock music. Like, tell us some about your journey of going from being the type of player who was reading notes on a page to giving yourself permission to improvise. And I have a story to tell you after you answer that, but yeah.
Don't leave me hanging.
I would love to hear more about how that was for you, because I can definitely relate to that. And I know there are a lot of people who only think I can only read what's on the page. And maybe that's true, but you're someone who has done both. So what did that require of you to be able to improvise?
Yeah, well, improvisation is not easy. Like anybody that says, hey, just pick up an instrument and start going at it or whatever, there's really like a mental block that you have to overcome. I'm not saying it's not easy to sort of dissuade people. I'm saying it's not easy as an empathetic way to sort of reach out to people who are struggling with this, because like I meet musicians all the time who are songwriters. They think they could never just pick up an instrument and start improvising because they need a chord progression and they need to write lyrics or whatever. And honestly, that's fine. Like no one needs improvisation in their lives, but improvisation is, I think, like a great sort of like life tool that you can borrow from to just enhance your life, whether creatively or just sort of enhance your life as a citizen, as a person who wants to sort of adapt to, you know, financial changes and different things, you know, like losing your job or whatever. If you kind of borrow from improvisational techniques or something, there's always this idea that you're reacting and responding, and you're constantly sort of on the move, and you recognize that nothing is ever going to stay fixed and stay constant, and it's like a recognition of that. So improvisation is like extremely helpful in all aspects of life and creativity, but it's not easy. Like there's some serious like mental blocks that you need to overcome, and for me, it took years to become comfortable with improvisation, and I think maybe part of that is sort of being like weaned into the classical system where you're sort of, there's like, you know, like a musical upbringing where your perspective is pretty much based on not just the notes on the page, but the notes in the register of the instrument that you play. Like a clarinetist can't play every note that's on the page, and we can't read every clef. So there's like already built in not an inferiority complex, but there's built-in limitations to your perspective on music. Some instruments, like I was saying before, you know, some instruments are not microtonal. Like I guess the piano, you know, there's sort of blues piano where you can create like, you know, you could sort of play two notes at the same time and it gives the impression of like a blues guitarist who's like bending a string, or sort of, you know, you can emulate that. But essentially, there are limitations with every instrument. And so improvisation is this sort of unlearning of those limitations. It's an unlearning of the idea that music needs to happen in a fixed grid of time and in a fixed sort of space notationally. And that there's other ways of engaging with notes and timbre and performance and breath and texture and feel and energy, and tempo and space, and, that don't necessarily have notational complements. So that's why I like improvisation, because it's a sort of explanation of all of that in between space that the world and life has to it, that the notes on the page can't necessarily explain or define for you. So I guess just like going back to sort of my own thing, like I improvised poorly when I was younger because I really like jazz. I was extremely taken away by John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Miles Davis. I was like so inspired by them, and yet I never had any jazz training. I never went to music school, and so the stuff that they were doing was completely beyond me. And whenever I tried to do it, I was very quickly met with this inferiority complex of like, okay, I cannot do this. This is not who I am as a musician. And it was like being punched and then falling over, and you kind of recover from that punch, and you have to sort of be like, what just happened? Eventually, I think one of the reasons why I got back into improvisation in general was because I became so comfortable with my practice as an artist. And in that comfort, and that's, sort of Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 hours kind of thing, where you put in the work, you just engage, you play music every day or as often as you can, and you think about music or whatever. Eventually you get to this place where I know what I'm doing. I know what these machines can do. I know how I engage with these machines. And I can play with that and just have fun with it. Open it up, and that through that way, I got back into improvisation. And now I feel like almost everything I do is improvisation. And I don't want a roadmap, frankly. Like, don't give me notes on a page. I'll figure it out, And now I feel like I'm sort of in the most healthy place in my life when it comes to sort of engaging musically, because I can compose and I can write a piece, but I also really enjoy improvising. I enjoy the spontaneity of it, and I enjoy the process of taking an improvisation and sculpting it into a composition and gleaning from that. So, yeah.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
But I really want to hear your story. Because
okay, I'll share my story. I just wanted to honor your process and your journey with that, and your vulnerability, and sharing with us how some of that came to life for you. Because, yeah, I know that journey well. And well, I have to thank you actually as the beginning to my story, because I don't know if you remember, but when I was still living in New York, and our friend Ian was having a bit of a gathering at his apartment, and instruments were welcome to come over for the dinner, I brought my clarinet and sat down to play with you and Ian, and I think Jillian was there too on piano. And you guys were a band. You guys were, cool. And you were
a little bit of a complicated environment to step into.
It was. And I tried my best to step into it, and I totally psyched myself out. I was unable to meet you guys in that space, and on the clarinet, improvise and jam, and I was like, I just was like, does not compute.
What happens if I play the wrong note?
Yeah,
oh my God, they're never gonna invite me back.
It was fear. It was my own limitations, those mental blocks you described. That is exactly what came up for me that night. And that was maybe 10 years ago now. And I love the way you ended your sharing, because I don't resonate with notes on a page really anymore. And I'm starting to study with a clarinet teacher this year who's advising that I give that a try. And I'm giving it a try, but it just doesn't work. What's working is feeling what sounds good. And what feels good for me to play, that is organic and authentic to what it is that I have to say. And I actually feel more confident now sitting down in a group without any music planned or rehearsed or really intended for us to do, and just see what happens.
Yeah,
And
totally.
and it's helpful that, I can ask, hey, what key are we playing in? That's helpful to know.
Sure.
But not even necessarily needing to know. But it's like, okay, that's a good starting place for me to just have a sense of a framework to explore and navigate and find something that's going to work. And then, what I do love about the film composing world too, which I want to hear more about from you, is how much of that is feeling based. And my clarinet teacher, who lives in New York City, David Krakauer, really incredible musician, he actually shared with me in our last lesson, because I was expressing to him some kind of trepidations around really seeing myself as a musician because I don't read music so much. And he said to me, Josh, two of the best film composers in the whole world can't read music. And that's the truth. It's not a prerequisite if you can tap into what is the feeling, what is the goal of what it is we're making, and maybe that's just to sit down and do something and have fun. Yeah, and it's so freeing, and I just love it. So it's a good kind of story to throw back to where at least I was at 10 years ago. And like, dude, I've always been so inspired by how you can just show up and kind of wing it or like improvise and figure it out. So yeah, you've always had that ability. It comes very naturally, I think.
I don't think I've always had that ability, but I don't know. Like there's different personality types, I think, that kind of playing with a bunch of musicians, whether you like it or not, is sort of a microcosm of society. Like there's going to be dominant personalities. There's going to be people who are not confident in themselves, or that's just, it plays out like that. It's like a work of theater or something. And that kind of sucks, but it is the way it is. But I just like, yeah, I love that idea of just sort of showing up with a bunch of musicians where there's a little bit of trust involved, and just sort of like feeling some different stuff out. Because to me, like the most important thing in improvisation and also collaboration, like working with other musicians, whether it's like a project that needs to be executed, or it's just like, showing up and playing or whatever, like collaborating with somebody in the moment. I think the most important thing is listening. And so if you're confident, not confident, if you're like dominant or slightly passive or whatever, if there's an environment that is conducive to listening and deep listening and really just sort of allowing for space for other musicians, then everybody's going to be fine. So it's kind of a mentality thing. I think it's important sometimes to realize too that like really all that sound is the vibrating of air molecules between, like a sonic event and your eardrum. One or both of your eardrums. That's all that it is, right? Like whether it's music or some bird in the distance or like the rustling of wind through trees or something like that. Like everything can be an improvisation. It could be a jam session. It can be a symphony. That's all that sound is. And so I think like over sort of intellectualizing it and imparting onto a musical or sonic act, our relationships with each other is like a sort of fallacy of humanity. It's like it's a shadow in our perspective as humans that we need to sort of constantly remind ourselves that the same sort of air molecules that are vibrating to let me know that you're playing an A flat, I breathed that in and then I breathed it back out and now you're breathing it in. That's all that it is, right?
Well, I'm thrilled that you mentioned listening. That's the question I always like to ask about, and you've already kind of led us there, so I'll continue and really, really resonate with how you describe what a jam session or band rehearsal feels like, because you're right. It is like a microcosm of society, and you're going to be working with all different kinds of people. I'm curious to kind of take that one step further, as you've in your life sat in those types of circles, Have you noticed in other parts of your life, perhaps in your relationships or your professional life, family life, has it affected your ability to listen to other people?
I would like to say that it's made me a better listener, but I don't know if I can say that. This is an interesting question. I'm not sure I've thought about that. But it's also kind of an opportunity for me to like talk about myself in a way that I don't know if I'm comfortable.
That's okay.
I gotta think about this.
Yeah, sure. Think about that one, and it's okay if the answer is no. That's totally fine.
Well, I will say that music in general has the power to heal, and it has the power to sort of impart empathy among people. And so the very act of just sort of like listening to music can be an education in sympathy and empathy and sort of a community-based mindset. Because everybody's engagement with music or song is different, and we have to sort of allow space for that. And there's this idea of what really is a society in general. A society is sort of it's like organized chaos. It's a lot of like unpredictable events happening within a sort of grid. There's this concept of katachi in Japanese Zen Buddhism. Katachi is the word that I guess you would translate into form. That's all that it really means when you translate it into English, but it's built from these two components, kata, which is pattern, so it's like a grid, and chi, which is this sort of spiritual energy. And it's like a magical component to it. So this concept of like anytime you have a form, you have the grid that the form takes shape to or belongs into, and then you have all this sort of inner stuff that you can't explain, this magical essence to it that it's basically like an infinite realm of possibilities. Whether we can see those possibilities or not, that's sort of inherent into this idea of katachi and form. And I like to think of society and community and our relationships as that kind of a thing, where there are rules, like in a marriage, for example, or in a friendship or in a professional relationship, there are rules and stuff. But within those rules, there's this infinite sort of realm of possibilities of sentiment and memories and ways of engaging with people that are based on like profound love and understanding and compassion and stuff. And so when it comes to listening to other people and being there for other people and being responsible for those relationships, I think it's always good to sort of recognize both. Recognize the kata, which is the rules of this relationship, and to recognize the chi, which is, the sort of magical, interpersonal, like invisible essence that defines this relationship or whatever, that you can explore within this relationship. So as a musician, I hope that I'm a good listener to my friends and stuff like that. But obviously, as a musician, one needs to make space for others. Like in music, you can't take up all the space. So it's an innate quality in all musicians that we need to sort of make space for others. And I think that that's really important. Whether it's gleaned into me or not is a different subject entirely.
Well, I appreciate your honesty with that question.
If my wife comes on this podcast, then she can answer that question better than I can, probably.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll do that next time, because I adore both of you, and it's hard to maybe answer that objectively.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for your honesty there, and I asked that question because I think in our society today, I personally observe so many problems coming down to the fact that people just aren't listening to each other. And it's a huge reason why I started this podcast and why I've started Embodied Sounds, to help people develop a healthy relationship with the practice of listening. And
yeah, that's great.
I'm noticing that as a big trend right now as well. I was just in Costa Rica, and a venue was doing weekly deep listening sessions where, you're going to love this actually, every Tuesday night they advertise to the public an album listening night, and they just put an album on start to finish. Everybody comes, lies down on the floor, no drugs, and just listens to the album. Maybe some drugs, but it's not part of it.
And then you talk about it, and then you realize that what you heard somebody else is not hearing, and et cetera. Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So I feel like more things like that, more opportunities to build connection and just like build that healthy practice and that process with using our ears,
That's actually like one of my favorite things about just being a musician in the world, and like a working musician, networking with other musicians, is like, if you put on an album, somebody next to you might be like, did you hear that sharp fourth? Like, did you hear that Lydian scale? Like, that was crazy, that's, and I okay, maybe I didn't hear that, but I heard that lyric that was like, open your eyes, blah, 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 or whatever. And that really speaks to me because yada, yada. And, there's a connection there actually, because that sharp fourth actually really opens up the scale, and it includes like a sort of like a sustained, harmonic sort of texture to it that really kind of opens and uplifts you, and it feels like when you're opening your eyes after awaking from a dream or something. So that lyric that you pointed out is actually really similar to what, that kind of stuff is just like, I take so much joy in those different ways of engaging with music. It's just great. Yeah.
Right on.
Next time you put on an album, definitely, this is going out to the listeners, not just to you, Josh. Like try to sort of organize something with a friend or a few friends or something where it's like, hey, I'm just feeling like listening to the White Album tonight. Like, anybody want to listen to that? And then tomorrow we can kind of like text about it or something, or hop on Zoom. It's always going to be a really good experience when you do that.
That's a great suggestion. I will put that in the show notes right there. That's awesome. Brings me back to the days of trading concerts back and forth with you and getting to talk about our experience, which we won't go into on this show, but definitely it was a fond memory of high school days.
Totally.
Yeah, and I'm curious in the present moment, while touring is not really possible and playing live is not really possible, like how have you been kind of getting your fix of music and of creativity? You did just release an album, so I imagine that took up a lot of time. If you want to tell us a little bit about that process, but what's kind of, in a more general sense, been some of your experience in the last year to just stay, like as positive as you can?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we're in the midst of this pandemic right now. It's going on for a year and a half almost. It's like kind of slogging through, and it's really tough for everyone. My personal relationship with creating art and creating music has been very complicated with this pandemic. Like, first of all, when the lockdown measures happened in Quebec and in Canada, at that point, I was 2 weeks away from hopping on a plane and going on tour in Europe for 5 weeks. So that tour got canceled, and my plane ticket, got canceled and all this kind of stuff. So the first phase of this pandemic was absolutely fraught with grief. I was grieving over the lack of live music. Like, I go to concerts like 2 or 3 times a week. Like, at least here in Montreal. There's an incredible live music scene here in Montreal, and I play concerts as much as I can. And I love going on tour where you play every night in a new city. So there's an element of grief that, oh my God, I can't go to a concert. I can't see my friends who I don't even have their phone numbers, because I just know that they're going to be at the bar at this venue if I'm there. And if they're not, then I'll see them the next time or whatever. Like, and then I can't go on my tour or something. There was a major sort of grieving phase for me at the beginning of the pandemic. And eventually I kind of like got over it. And I started to sort of live a little bit more positively and think towards the future. And, okay, we're all in this together. We're going to get through this. And I can't take this stuff personally. And I started to sort of get back to work creating music in my studio. But I'll admit, like, for a really long time, I was not inspired. Like, you know, I did a couple things for myself where I like had some projects that I wanted to sort of try to execute. And then I did a couple things for like friends or collaborators or clients that really just felt like work. It was like black and white. There was no color. It was really hard. And I talked a lot about that experience with other musicians and other artists throughout the pandemic. And I think actually the fact that I was sort of like really open about that, like open about my inability to feel creative and to feel inspired and to feel like I was constantly hitting like a block where this all just feels like work. This doesn't feel, I don't like this. I don't want, the fact that I was able to kind of open up and sort of address this kind of stuff with other people and to hear their sides of that and to hear them kind of mirroring my experience actually kind of helped me get through it. And it helped me kind of start to get a little bit more creative again. And maybe part of that is just like the fact that we've been going through this for so long that it's almost starting to feel normal now. Like it's normal that I work from home and that I, what it means to collaborate, quote unquote, is a little bit different than it was before, honestly. Maybe we're all getting used to it and stuff, but it was like a really difficult journey. I don't think I remember what your original question was, but it definitely kind of made me think about that. But nowadays, I'm a little bit more used to it. I have taken a step back. Like I'm trying to think more about my like work-life balance, and that includes creative work, because creative work is a lot of times it's unpaid work, and so you sort of feel like you can feel enslaved by this kind of work if you don't have a good sort of support network, or you're not getting paid for it or something. It can be really tough mentally. And I think that contributes to a little bit of a mental health crisis in the sort of creative community. But yeah, just to sort of like use your network and your community for acknowledgement and like expressing your feelings and stuff openly, I think is always going to be really healthy. And it definitely helped me. So I've been trying to sort of take a little bit of a step back. It's a really weird phase right now because I'm promoting an album that I recorded before the pandemic. So I recorded the album. I maybe mixed it during the pandemic or something like that. But the fact that it took so long to come out is simply a result of vinyl pressing plants being closed and manufacturers being a little bit slower, and there's lots of delays in the process and stuff. But the idea that it's the summertime and we're in this pandemic, and so there's no touring, there's no sort of ability to kind of like promote the album as I, go out into the world and stuff like that is a very bizarre experience. I do not recommend this. Promoting an album from my home is difficult and strange and foreign. But I really like the album, though. So, if other people listen to it and they like it, that's pretty much all I need. I just want people to let me know that they've listened and here's what they think about it. And that's fine.
Very well said, my friend. Thank you for for the honesty of just not being inspired a little bit too. It's
Totally.
and that's okay, and part of the process. I feel you, on a very human level there. And
don't feel guilty for the feelings that you have, right? Like, it's never easy. If you can come to a point in your life where creating, interesting, engaging, thought-provoking artwork is easy, you're probably doing it wrong, right? Like, there's always going to be obstacles, and you got to roll with the punches and stuff like that. But that just means that we as artists and we as creative people need to be communicating these things. Like, our feelings are our inspiration for our work. So lean in, right?
Right on. Yes. 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 I love that. And there's so much available when we can lean into those feelings and allow them all to be expressed and experienced.
Play around in it.
Well, given the fact that you did just release Amara, is there anything you'd like to tell us about it, and kind of let us know where we can hear it and where we can learn more about you? What should people know?
Yeah, well, my name is Jeremy Young, so you could go to jeremyyoung.bandcamp.com, or you can just Google search Jeremy Young. You're going to find a male model based in London, a concert cellist. There may or may not be a sex offender. And then there's going to be me somewhere in there. And I make electroacoustic music. But no, hopefully there's going to be links and stuff in this podcast. But essentially this album actually incorporates a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. Like, it incorporates my relationship with sort of creating work as a solo performer and motivating myself and inspiring myself and sort of finding my process through, a long-term engagement with my way of working. But it's also a collaborative album. So it's a solo album, and you're going to hear me put together these pieces using sine and square wave oscillators, tape machines, and amplified objects and surfaces. So there's tones and there's textures and there's rhythms. But against that backdrop, there's violin, there's spoken word poetry, there's a little bit of harp, there's the sounds of 16 millimeter cameras and projector equipment. There is the sound of tiny pine cones and voice. There's all kinds of stuff on there. And the idea was that the idea behind Amara was that I would sort of build these little motifs and like looping fragments and stuff, send them to the collaborators, have them respond in some way, and that I would sort of intake those contributions from my collaborators and reframe those like looping fragments as now compositions with their own contexts. So the process of creating the record, it took a really long time, but it was really interesting because it started from a place of improvisation and sort of open-ended exploration. And then it was just like a chipping away. Like, here's something that this other person has given me. I didn't think of it like that. This is all new to me. Like, I'm hearing stuff that I had never heard before because they're sort of bringing in this alternate perspective on it. Now I'm going to reframe what I was thinking about this piece. And then I stripped away the loops, and I started to build piece by piece each song and each work on the record as like a microcosm of its own sort of contextual upbringing. It was really interesting. It's really kind of amazing. At the same time, what links the record is a deep exploration into my own creative process, so that sonically, even though there's all these other contributors and collaborators, it doesn't sound like bric-a-brac, like this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, or whatever, and throw it all into the mix or whatever. I tried to sort of make it feel like it was my own momentum and my own sort of sonic environment that I was sort of creating. So that's pretty much why I'm really proud of this record. You mentioned at the start of this podcast that I've done a lot of records. I have a couple bands and I've done a lot of solo albums and stuff like that. What makes this different is that I've brought in those perspectives with this purpose. Like the idea that I'm a collaborative person and I'm an improvisational person and I want to incorporate that, but I also want it to be definitively, a portrait of my sort of sonic capabilities as an artist. And I think it comes through in a really strong way here. So, that's why I'm proud of it.
Nice work, Jeremy. That's really fantastic. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for asking me about it.
Yeah, I know how personal of a journey it is. And I love how you've embraced this new way of collaborating too. And really am inspired, because collaboration, I think, is the key to competition in so many levels. And to be able to do that remotely and have the patience to let those pieces come back to you and be open to do something with it that maybe you didn't think you would do totally. That shows a lot of your inner strength, of being able to overcome like that. Oh, it wasn't exactly the way I thought it was going to be, and still flow.
That's okay. Exactly. Okay. Like, okay, that's what he was thinking. Like, that's interesting. Okay, let me sort of roll with this for a little bit.
Amazing.
It's crazy how much you sort of grow in that way, because whenever you work with somebody else, like a collaborator or just casually working with somebody, even if it's not for an album, just sort of like throwing ideas at the wall or something, like you have to adapt. Like you have to sort of open your mind to what they're thinking, because they're not always going to fit into the box that you're trying to put them in. You have to sort of redesign that box. Like it might not be a square. It might be like some sort of weird, rhombus shaped box. That's fine.
I love that, man. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And is there anything else you'd like to tell people before we close?
I'm good, man. Thank you. Thanks, Josh, so much for inviting me. This was a great conversation. Your podcast is amazing. And I wish you well in Costa Rica, where you're headed, and I wish you well on the retreat that you're organizing and you're about to sort of execute. I think that's a great project, and I'm just so happy that our paths have sort of crossed in this way. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's great to see you, and let's do this again soon for episode 2 with Jeremy Young. And thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe and consider becoming a Patreon of Embodied Sounds so you can help fund the creation of this podcast. It definitely takes a lot of energy, and I'm hoping to keep it advertising free. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.